What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into some of the new starter decks that will be coming into MTG Arena for players who have been playing MTG Arena for the past year or so, and some of the people who have maybe just gotten into the game itself after Adventure of the Forgotten Realms. In today's video, we'll be going over a few of the decks that will be going through and upgrading and giving you guys ideas on how to go about maybe upgrading the decks if you're looking to maybe expand upon maybe these decks that you have gotten for free. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. It puts a plus one counter on the channel. And with that being said, let's just dive into the video and let's just talk about it. So first and foremost thing, before we kind of dive into each of the decks and go over the upgraded versions of the decks, I will have all the links for these decks down in the description below. So if you want to check out the upgraded version compared to the original list, I would suggest you can look down there and you can get the link to the completed deck list so you can see where you can go about upgrading the decks. The other thing to note is if you go about upgrading the decks and you want to make sure you have a copy of the original, I would say just make sure you go into the deck tab at the bottom where you see the things that say import, export, and things like that. Just hit the clone one on the deck that you maybe wanted to upgrade as you have an extra copy, just in case if something gets screwed up, you don't ruin your original copy and then you can't go back to playing the deck that you do enjoy playing. And the third thing is, if you don't see the deck in the video today, I will be doing future videos of this about the other decks that are also being added to the game and getting upgrades. I just figured I'd do little small segments on each of the decks, rather not to overload you with all the decks all at once. So with that being said, let's talk about the first deck, which is Treasure Hunt. Treasure Hunt is kind of playing that Rakdos package that you kind of maybe see in Rakdos Sacrifice. It's playing a lot of things that help produce treasure tokens to gain benefits and things like that. First and foremost, right off the list, the list has a lot of good tools, a lot of tools that are actually very strong for the colors that are here. One of them being things like Deadly Dispute has turned out to be a very good card in standard so far, just because of its ability to draw 2 cards, create a treasure token at the cost of either sacrifice an artifact and or a creature. Shambling Glass has been a very good, strong one-drop for mono black or any deck that plays black of some sort because of the -1 ability, also the Search of Body to create a treasure token, and the third card being the Skullport Merchant. I think these 3 cards combined together are very strong. It makes black a lot more aggressive in what it's trying to do, and in this package, creating treasures is kind of the key, so these cards definitely do work in this starter deck. So the first and foremost thing I will say before we kind of dive into is these are probably key areas where you want to maybe focus on upgrading first, as these cards are uncommons and commons, to then upgrade them to maybe having 4 copies of, because I do think getting these cards consistently in your matchups is going to be key. But that being said, let's dive into the upgraded deck list and check that out. So first and foremost, I really didn't change up too much from the original deck list for the most part. I did get rid of some of the cards I just don't think work currently in the deck itself, and I added in a few other cards that I do think are definitely good, and I added in some cards that I do think benefit from this certain package. With that being said, it is a 60 card deck still. Nothing really dramatically has changed, though the rares and mythics have overall increased just to add in the additional threats and very powerful cards that help make the deck work. So the first and foremost, as you can see here, like I said, we went up to the 4 copies of Shambling Gas because of its abilities of Brave the Stench, which is the -1/-1 ability, and Search the Body for the treasure token ability. In the 2-drop slot, we added up to 4 copies of Deadly Dispute. Like I said, this is a very strong card. If you see anyone playing any sort of black in standard 2022, they're more than likely playing this card in their library just because it is another good card. Now, the original Treasure Hunt only had 2 of these. I just went up to 4. We do have dragons in the deck, so this card can become very good. Nonetheless, it is still a 2 mana, 3 damage target creature or Planeswalker card, so it definitely fits the deck and the style of what we're trying to build in the deck. Callian Painter is another good card in the deck. It is a legendary creature. I know typically in a lot of my decks, when I do post legendary creatures, usually don't do more than 3 but I do think this is a very good tempo booster, as it makes a lot of our threats that we do play with treasure mana that much stronger, which makes them even more powerful and makes our opponent have to really either deal with this or deal with a much stronger threat. And I do like the idea that when it comes to the battlefield, we create a treasure token. In the 3-drop slot, we also went up to 4 copies of the Skullport Merchant. Like I said, just like the other cards, it's a great card. Creates a treasure token when it comes to the battlefield, and the ability to tap 2 mana, sacrifice another creature or treasure, draw a card. So if your opponent targets maybe one of your creatures, you can sacrifice it in response, draw a card out of it, or just sacrifice one of your treasure tokens to draw a card out of it. So nonetheless, it's just a very strong card ability with really no big drawback other than having to sacrifice something. Sometimes you get a lot of treasure mana out, so it's okay to sacrifice one of them, especially if you don't maybe have the Killian out on the battlefield yet. Just a very good card for 2 mana, draw a card by sacrificing. Soul Shatter is very good also in the deck. It's a very strong card, as it makes your opponent have to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker with the highest mana value among creatures or planeswalkers they control. It doesn't target the creature directly, so your opponent sacrifices the creature. And nonetheless, it's 2 copies of in the deck because I do think it's a good card to have. It's not something that really helps what we're trying to do. We are kind of going more into the treasure creation and creatures that help us get this there for the most part, with a little bit of spot removal here and there. Then the next card up is Zorn. This is a very interesting card. It is something that at one point I was thinking about playing 4 copies of, because the idea of creating additional treasure tokens when things create treasure tokens is definitely very good. But the one downfall to it is a 3/2, so the 2 toughness isn't great. So this is something I kind of went with only 2 copies of. It's a benefit to have on the battlefield if we can get it to stick. But it's not one of those things that are necessary really to make the deck work very, very well, but it is something that is nice to have. In the 4-drop slot, we went up to 2 Immerstrom Predators. It's a 4-mana 3/3 with flying. When it becomes tapped, exile 1 target card from a graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And its other ability is we can sacrifice another creature. It gains indestructible end of turn and tap it. So it's kind of like an interesting card in the sense that it can attack and aggressively and gets bigger and bigger the more we swing in and out our opponent. And the other thing too is we can sacrifice it if our opponent's trying to do some sort of removal, though it doesn't protect it from sacrifices and things like that, or any sort of exile effect. It can at least, from direct damage, and or maybe your opponent somehow has a blocker in some sort of way. Given indestructibility is definitely very good nonetheless. And, it kind of creates some other things, like we want to, sacrifice a Shambling Gas. We can always sacrifice it to this to then, make it indestructible as well. Then also we have Orcus, Prince of the Undeath. It's a 4-mana 5/3 with an X cost and ability. Enters the battlefield, we get to choose one. Each creature gets -X/-X into end of turn. You lose X life. So it gives some sort of board wipe ability, especially if your opponent's playing aggro. So that's definitely very good for the deck. And then the other ability here is for X, we can return creature card with total mana value X or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, and they gain haste until end of turn. So we get to attack in very aggressively. So if we tap this for 3. So in total 7 mana, we can get back a 2-drop and a 1-drop. They gain haste. We can swing in aggressively, or if we have a lot of mana, we can tap it for very large, get back a lot of things, and then swing in aggressively as well. But nonetheless, I do think it's kind of like, because we're not playing Shadow's Verdict or any other Blood on the Snow or things like that. It's a very strong card because of the -X/-X, which definitely also gets around indestructibility. Then in the 5-drop slot, we went up to 4 copies of Goldspan Dragon. This is just a very strong card. It in itself creates treasure tokens, and it makes our treasures create more mana or additional mana than the original one that it sacrifices for. So it's one of those things that is just very good for the deck. It's the treasure maker of the deck for the most part. And then when it becomes target of spell or ability, it creates a treasure token, so it is strong in that sense. And it has flying and haste, which makes it very hard for your opponent to really block. And especially when we start getting this going, as long as our other things, it can create very, very, very hard situations for your opponent to have to deal with. Goldspan Dragon is one of those key cards that you'll see a lot of in the format. I do think going forward, if anyone's playing red, it's in Prismari, it's in here. Any deck that has some sort of red will probably play Goldspan Dragon just for this ability. And then in the 6-drop slot, we add in Inferno, Star of the Mounts. It's the 6-drop, 6/6 flying haste dragon that can't be countered. And we tap a red, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And when its power becomes 20 this way, it deals 20 damage to any target. So the one big thing in this deck that I do think was kind of a cool trick that I kind of been experimenting with and kind of messing around with is if we can get a lot of treasures out and we actually, have Callian out in the battlefield and we play that treasure man to cast the Inferno. The Inferno can come onto the battlefield as being a possible much larger creature, which means we have to tap less red mana to get that actual ability of making it into a 20, whatever. So that is definitely very good. It's one of those things the fact that it can't be countered is also very good. We are playing 3 copies of it because it is legendary. You can only have 1 on the battlefield. But nonetheless, it is a strong card, and I do think it fits well with this sort of style deck. We're being very aggressive with what we're playing in the deck to kind of, beat down on our opponent and, making a lot of mana in the process trying to do so. The mana base really didn't change too much. We did add in 4 copies of the Pathways, but we did sacrifice the Mountains and Swamps. Other than that, the deck is pretty straightforward. Like I said, the list will be down in the description below if you want to, see where you're at with your current copy of this deck, if you do have it, and see how you maybe want to go about, upgrading your deck into this version. I don't think you need to kind of upgrade everything all at once, but this is something you can work towards if this is something you're looking to upgrade, maybe if you like this deck a lot. So the next deck up on the list is Sky Patrol, and this is actually a very interesting deck. It's kind of like a weird Fortelli, aggro-y kind of control style You know, Azurius deck. I really, it was really hard to kind of figure out what this deck really wanted to be, because it kind of does a lot of things. It has a lot of aspects of the deck that really want to control the battlefield and prevent your opponent from really playing a lot of things, as it has Doom Scars, it has, you know, Saw Cummins, it has things that exile your opponent's creatures, and then it also wants to, you know, be aggressive as well, because it does play some creatures take benefit from us foretelling our cards, you know, letting us draw some cards and things like that. So it's definitely very interesting, because the idea of having something like a card like Doomscar but having creatures on the battlefield is something you really don't want to wipe your own board just to kind of wipe your opponent's side of the board, but it's definitely a good card to have if that's something you're looking to do. There's some interesting cards that I would say are definitely some things you probably want to cut first, just like the Expels and the Iron Verdicts. Sure, they're decent cards, but they're very situational. If your opponent doesn't have any creatures on the battlefield, these cards really don't do anything. Or if their creatures have Vigilance, they don't also do anything, so it's definitely very tough. So these are definitely cards that I kind of removed initially when I went ahead and did it, but it has a lot of interesting tools that I kind of try to still utilize to kind of create a version of this deck that is upgraded. It may not be exactly the same style of deck, but I feel like it's in a good balance of kind of being like this, but with a little bit of a twist to it, just kind of make it that much better. So here's the list. I mean, nothing, like I said, has changed too much. I added some more copies of cards that are good in the deck to kind of make it that much better, and I also added some cards that are just very good for the colors nonetheless, like Alrund's Epiphany being a card that just allows you to take extra turns, and you can foretell it, so you can make it cost 1 cheaper and then cast it later in the game, which is definitely very good. And I just added in some more of the copies of the rares and things like that in the deck that kind of think, you know, with these additional cards, I do feel like it's in a decent balance of, hey, I can be aggressive, and then in the slight chance I need to kind of disrupt some things, I do have some cards that can do so. So I added in 4 copies of Doomscar, I added 4 copies of Saw Coming. You know, I added some cards that help me draw some cards. I have Portable Hole. I do think there's some utility here that kind of, you know, hopefully battles against a lot of the other decks to kind of help you out. But at the same time, too, it has a package in there that can be very, very aggressive. I'm actually very surprised in how strong Stonebinder's Familiar is. It doesn't seem anything too crazy, but whenever one or more cards are put into exile during our turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Stonebinder's Familiar, and this ability only triggers once each turn. But there's a lot of cards that you actually not just foretell that actually make this go off. So it's something like a Portable Hole. If we exile one of our opponent's things, it will give a +1/+1 counter to the Stonebinder's Familiar. Elite Spellbinder, we attack our opponent's hand, make one of their spells cost more, gives a +1/+1 counter to the Stonebinder's Familiar. So like I said, a lot of cards are in the deck that, you know, help, you know, build up Stonebinder's Familiar so we can be aggressive if that's what we need to do. It's kind of like if you ever played Dimir Rogues. I know it's a very terrible example. Not many people like that deck, but it's a deck that, like, when Dimir Rogues wanted to be the aggressor, it could be the aggressor, but at the same time too, when it wanted to be the control deck, it could be kind of like the control deck against the more aggressive deck. So I do think this deck is kind of in that situation. Maybe it's not as tempo-y, but it is, I think, has a lot of cards that could make it very, you know, very strong, especially if this is like one of the first decks you're looking to upgrade and kind of add some more powerful cards to it, and you're looking for that little bit of control. I do think this is a pretty decent control, mid-rangey kind of style deck that can also be slightly an aggro deck when it needs to be. That being said, you know, this deck has a lot of cool utility. You know, Portable Hole, it's a very, you know, it's good against the very aggressive decks, and this deck isn't the most aggressive, so it is good to disrupt the early game against your opponent, and hitting things mana value 2 or less on your opponent's side of the field until it leaves the battlefield is definitely very good. I kind of already talked about Stonebinder's Familiar. It gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you know, a card is put into exile during our turn, and that means from any sort of exile source, so definitely a strong card there. Luminarch Aspirant, it's kind of one of those things that was in the deck, but I don't think it was really, you know, it's not a super aggro deck, so I don't think I need 4 copies of, but if it's one of those things that we do get in the early game, it's definitely good and helps us be more aggressive, so I do have 2 copies in the deck. Elite Spellbinder is another strong card in the deck. It is a 3 mana 3/1, hits our opponent's hands, makes their cards more expensive to cast at whatever we hit with it by making it cost 2 more. So either disrupting maybe their curve, like maybe they draw a 1/2/3 turn, but we play Elite Spellbinder first. Now that 3-drop is now a 5-drop, and now it disrupts maybe their turn 3, and it, you know, makes the game, you know, on their side of the board maybe go a little bit slower. Grazalix is another interesting card here. It is a 3 mana 3/2. Whenever a creature we control becomes blocked, we return to our hand. And whenever one or more creatures deal combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. So it's kind of like a tempo card, and it makes us be able to attack into our opponent and not have to worry about something dying in the process of combat damage, because whatever gets blocked, we can always just bounce back if we don't want it to die in that process. So definitely very good there. saw coming for that disruption. I think blue's kind of idea, it doesn't really have a lot of ways to really, disrupt or destroy creatures on the battlefield. So disrupting what your opponent's doing is always very good. Maybe your opponent taps out to play a spell. You saw it coming. And now, their turn's pretty much they're tapped out and you're good to go. Starnheim Unleashed is a very interesting card. It is kind of like a two-way card. You pay for the 4 mana to get the 4/4 angel token creature with flying and vigilance, or you can foretell it, and in the late game you can play like a 7 mana for copy of this and get 3 angels on it, and then kind of get that aggressiveness that you may need. And there's 12 points in the air, fly and vigilance. If your opponent doesn't have any flyers, is pretty much will be unblockable, and you can have them back as defenders. So overall, very strong card there. Beholding Multiverse is a very strong tempo card, foretell in the early game. Tap it for 2 mana in the late game, scry 2, and then draw 2 cards. Yet again, a very strong card. Cosmos Charger, 4 mana, 3/3, flash flying, foretelling cards from our hand, cost 1 less. It can be done on any player's turn, so you can foretell at the end of your opponent's turn as long as this is out on the battlefield. And we can foretell it in the early game and play for 3 mana later down the road if we were looking to maybe catch our opponent off guard by flipping the foretell of this card and then playing the flash 3/3 flyer. To swing it maybe on our turn, or possibly block something your opponent doesn't think we have a blocker for. Then we have 4 copies of Doomscar, just because sometimes maybe we can't be super aggressive, or our opponent's very, very aggressive, or much more aggressive than we are. We have a card that kind of just wipes the board and it's reset, and let's kind of slow the game down again. Definitely good. It can be a 5 mana board wipe, or in the early game we can foretell it and then be a 3 mana board wipe eventually at some point. And then Allrun's Epiphany, because taking extra turns is great. Getting burnt tokens out of it is also very good. It just works with the deck and what we're trying to do. It's a very powerful card. Extra turns in general, can change the game in our favor, because we can attack in twice. If opponent's tapped out, they can't really interact. We just get to do whatever we want to do. And because it's kind of a control deck, I do think the mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 4 pathways, 4 of the Glacial Floodplains, 7 islands, and 9 plains. Definitely very strong here. I do think, like I said, it is kind of like an Azorius control deck, but at the same time it could be like an Azorius mid-rangey kind of style deck as well. And this is definitely a very good deck for someone who wants to play that style of deck. Now the next deck up on the list is the Savage Lands deck, and this is actually a very interesting deck because it's doing a couple different things I do find to be very unique in what it's trying to do. This is actually somewhat similar to a deck I did do when Adventures of the Forgotten Realms did come out. I actually didn't know this deck existed, and it's kind of playing like a little bit of the landfall, a little bit of the pack tactics, and it's playing some interesting cards that definitely make that kind of happen. And there's some decent cards that in the deck that I do think work, and there's some cards that I feel like I'm not really sure, but I do get it because it is a starter deck. Cards I do like is things like Brushfire Elemental. It's a very aggressive card. It attacks in very hard, very quickly in the early game because it can't be just chump blocked by 1/1 tokens or anything with power 2 or less, which is definitely very good. And whenever we're playing lands, it's +2/+2 to end a turn, so that's definitely very good. Occam Hellhound. It's sure it's a 0/1. But as long as we can get, lands on a lot of turns, it can attack in pretty aggressively in the early game because it becomes a 2/3, which is definitely something your opponent may not want to block, especially if they're trying to, do their own thing on their side of the board, especially set up their early game. Other than that, Kazandu Mammoth, it's a, a 3/3, but can also be a land in case we need that additional green mana. Evolve Wilds triggers our additional landfall triggers. Targnar, I'm not really 100% sure on if I'm a fan of in this deck, but he does kind of work because it does make our creatures that much stronger, and in himself we can actually double his power and toughness at the end of turn. And it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, so it's definitely kind of one of those things. It has a lot of good things going for it, but I do think there's some things I kind of tweak and I feel like make it a little bit better, make it a little bit more aggressive, because I do think that's the style of the deck. We want to attack in big damage very, very early and very, very aggressively before our opponent really can set up their board and try to stop it. So my version of the deck is pretty similar to the previous version. Like I said, I don't want to change up too much of the deck to kind of not make it feel kind of like what the starter deck was prior, as there are cards that could probably make this deck even better. I do think what I did choose for the deck is still pretty good. We went up to 4 copies of the Hellhound, the 1 mana 0/1. Whenever land enters the battlefield, it gets +2/+2 and end of turn, so definitely a good card in the early game. Royal Eruption, I think there was already 3 copies. I can't remember exactly, but we have 3 copies of it. It is kind of one of those spells that deals 3 damage to any target, though it is at sorcery speed. But in the late game, we can actually kick it for 5. And this deck has a good way of ramping up, so we could get that 5 additional mana to kick it, to pay the 7 mana to do just 5 damage to the face, to maybe finish off the game, especially where our opponent is life point wise. We added an Emergent Sequence, as this is a very interesting card, kind of with our rampiness of the deck. In the early game, we can kind of just get that one, that additional land on the battlefield. That's a 2/2 land. As well, so it's a creature that's a fractal and also a land at the same time too. But if we get it on a turn where we're playing Evolving Wilds and then we play this, we can get a 3/3 or a 4/4 land, which is also very good. Brushfire Elemental, like I said, 4 copies. This is definitely a card that is like a must draw for this deck, as it's kind of one of those cards that definitely hits your opponent very hard, very, very quickly. Sure, if you play it on turn 2, you really don't have a land to kind of make it that much stronger, but it is one of those things that can get that extra point of damage that can't be blocked by creatures of power 2 or less. Targnar, we just kept the 2 copies just because it is kind of a benefit to have, but it's not one of those things that we need to have on the battlefield to be very aggressive against our opponent. Vulcan Bugbear, I just kind of kept it in the deck as it was just a very solid 3-drop for being a 3/3. It doesn't do anything that amazing. It's just very vanilla, but I do think it kind of works just being aggressive, playing 3 mana 3/3s, which is very good. I know it's not a Goblin deck and it doesn't really do any of the other things our deck does, but it just kind of works for what we do. Kazandu Mammoth, we went up to 4 copies because this is another key card that if we play on turn 3, it's a 3/3, but then the following turns, as long as we're playing lands, it's at least a 5/5. And if we play anything where we can play double lands on a turn, it could be even stronger. And it's definitely a card that your opponent has to deal with, or it becomes a very large elephant that they can't deal with. We went up to 2 copies of Toski, Bearer of Secrets. It's the 1 mana 1/1. Can't be countered. It has to attack each turn of combat if able, and then whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So this is kind of like our tempo card. We don't need the cards to really win the game, but drawing cards is always a good thing, especially when we're looking for those lands to get those landfall triggers. Having this card on the battlefield to get card draw out of it is definitely very good. Then we have 2 copies of Aspid Surge. It's a 4 mana ramp spell that we get to search our library for 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, and this spell is kicked. We get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature we control. In the early game, it's a very strong card. Play it after we maybe have a Kazdu Mammoth, Brushfire Elemental, a Akum Hellhound. All of a sudden now we're getting 2 additional lands, get 2 additional landfall triggers, possibly the land that we did play creates another additional landfall trigger, and the game could be over right then and there just because all those landfall triggers and all those plus X based on the creatures, it can end the game right then and there. Then we have Froghemoth. It's a very interesting card in the deck that I added. It's kind of interesting in the sense that I feel like he hasn't seen too much play, but I do like the idea where he fits in the deck. It has Trample, it has Haste. When it deals combat damage to a player, we have to exile up to that many target cards from that player's graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature that we exile this way, so it gets bigger. And then we gain 1 life for each non-creature card exiled this way. So definitely a good way to kind of regroup some life that we may have lost, but at the same time too, it's a creature that gets bigger, has Trample, which is also very good. Eats our opponent's graveyard, so our opponent's trying to do anything kind of weird or with their graveyard, we can eat a lot of the things that they may want to try to return back from their graveyard. But nonetheless, it is a very interesting card. 2 copies of. We also have Inferno of the Star Mounts. Like I said, it's a very solid 6-drop, 6/6 flying haster, can't be countered. And with all our mana that we can get ramped out onto the battlefield, we can always tap it and make it that much stronger and finish off the game that way. Or we play the Pyleth World Sculptor. It's a legendary creature, 6 mana, 5/5. Enters battlefield, we get some 0/1 plant token creatures for each basic land we control. The deck plays a decent amount of basic lands, so we could get 4, 5, 6 basic land, plant creatures. But it has the ability that whenever we play a land and enters battlefield we control, we get to put +4 +1/+1 counters on target plant creature control. So these tokens will eventually become 4/5s, which then we can attack it more aggressively against our opponent, or we just have a bunch of chump blockers in case our opponent is trying to attack it in as well. But nonetheless, the deck is kind of pretty much the same with a couple different tweaks. I added in the 4 more pathways to the there. We already had the 4 Evolving Wilds, we have the Highland Forest, 6 forests, 8 mountains. Unfortunately, there isn't really too much of the other fetches currently in Standard 2022. I don't know if that's going to change, but Evolving Wilds does it justice as it can still trigger multiple landfalls on the same turn. But nonetheless, this deck is very good, can be very aggressive against your opponent. Now, I kind of saved like the I guess the best deck for last. I do feel like a lot of people are big fans of this deck, and that is the Lifeline deck. It is a deck that utilizes the life gain mechanic in Magic to kind of get additional +1/+1 counters on creatures we control in our deck to kind of get very, very big creatures that do a lot of things to the deck. Like I said, this is probably one of the starter decks I do think right off the bat is a very strong starter deck and can be very good even playing against some of the more competitive decks in the format as a whole. The idea that has a lot of cards that help us gain life is definitely very good. And I know some of you guys, when I did do the starter deck video, we're talking about some cards that were from the mono white starter deck that didn't make their their way to this deck. But I know, just as a quick heads up, most of these decks, they're trying to play all the current sets in standard most of the time when they build these decks, so they don't include the special mono-colored starter cards, just because those are exclusive to Magic the Gathering only, and those cards aren't technically standard legal outside of Magic the Gathering Arena at best of 1. So that's kind of why those cards didn't make the actual starter deck. But nonetheless, this deck does a lot of things good. Like I said, it has Tralacera, Moondancer, 2-mana 2/2. Whenever we gain life, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and we get to scry, which is definitely very good. So we can always look for whatever we need based on the situation. Another good card for the deck is Cleric class. I do like this card in the sense that, one, it makes us gain 1 additional life point, whenever we gain life. But I do like the 4-mana level up ability that we get to, whenever we gain life, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. And we got the 5-mana level 3 ability that whenever it becomes level 3, we get to return a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield, and we gain life equal to its toughness. So we can get back a lot of our creatures that may have died in the early game back onto the battlefield, and we gain some life based on its toughness. And we do have some cards that have big toughness. Prosperous Innkeeper is another great card for these life gain decks, just because whenever we play a creature, we gain 1 life based whenever a creature comes in the battlefield, and we get a treasure token out of it, so it's definitely very good mana ramp. Other than that, it does a lot of other things very good. It's just a very solid mechanic. I do think a lot of cards work really, really well rated in this package, even if some of the rares we only have 1 ofs. But nonetheless, let's talk about the upgraded version of the deck, just because I feel like that's a lot of what you guys are looking for. So in the upgraded version of the deck, I mean, the deck list really didn't change too much. I did get rid of some of the cards I just didn't feel like it worked. I did add in a copy of a card that is only exclusive to the mono Magic the Gathering Arena. It is standard legal only in best of 1, but I do think it works well for the deck, but it's only a 2 copy of. But nonetheless, we went up to 4 copies of the Cleric class, the 1-mana enchantment that, makes us gain that 1 additional life point whenever we gain life. You tap 4 mana, give, whenever gain life, get to put a +1/+1 counter target creature control. And for 5, we get to return a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield, gain life equal to its toughness. In the 2-drop slot, like I said, we have the Hallowed Priest, exclusive only to the starter decks, exclusive to Magic the Gathering Arena, best of 1. It is standard legal and best of 1 in Arena. If you try to play best of 3, it'll probably yell at you saying this card isn't legal, so it is only usable in best of 1. Devouring Tendrils is an interesting card in the deck. We went with 4 copies of. The one problem with mono white in the way, other than board wipes, there's not really too many ways to kind of really remove creatures, and Devouring Tendrils kind of helps us there. Basically what it is a 2-mana target creature control deals damage to target creature or planeswalker we don't control. When the permanent you don't control dies this turn, you gain 2 life. Just kind of a little bit of a fight spell. It's definitely very good. A lot of our creatures can get very, very big, and the 2 life helps us with our little bit of life gain. We went 2 copies of Inscription of Abundance. As this is kind of one of those interesting things, that is we get to choose various things, and in the later game when we have a lot of mana, we can always kick it. But the first one is we get to put a 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, make one of our creatures bigger. Target player gains X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures they control. So if we have a really big creature, we can gain a lot of life. And target creature we control fights another target creature we don't control. So it's a built-in fight spell, and for 5 mana we can do all of them if we really, really wanted to. Nonetheless, it's a very good card because we can do it all at instant speed. We went up to 4 copies of the Prosperous Innkeeper. Enters the battlefield, create a treasure token. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under control, we gain 1 life. We have a lot of creatures in the deck, so we'll gain a lot of life, which will help our life gain style deck that's trying to pump creatures up. We have Tralacera, Moondancer, 2-mana 2/2. Gets +1/+1 counter every time we gain life, and we get to scry 1 as well. We went to 4 copies of Core Celebrant. This is another great card in the deck that I do think is, a very decent blocker. It's 3 mana, so it's not the greatest, but whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield, we gain 1 life. We have 4 copies of Righteous Valkyrie, as a lot of cards in our deck are clerics, so we do get the benefit of The trigger, whenever Angel or Cleric enters the battlefield under our control, we gain life equal to that creature's toughness. And as long as we have 7 or more life than our starting life total, creatures we control get +2/+2. So it has a an Anthem style effect if we have more than 27 life in a standard match. I put in Cosmo Elixir as a very interesting card in the deck because we have a lot of ways to gain life. I do think this is one of those ways that we can, utilize that having higher than our starting life total to kind of draw cards. Other than that, we're going to have at least one way or another to gain life, gain triggers per turn. So that's why it's a 2 copy of in the deck. We have Froghemoth. Yet again, it's another card I do think works well for this deck. It is a 5 mana for 4 trample and haste. Eats things in the graveyard to get +1/+1 counters as long as they're creatures. And if we eat any non-creature cards exiled this way, we get to gain 1 life for each card exiled this way. So just another thing to trigger life gain triggers. I went to 2 copies of Drizzt. It's a 5 mana 3/3 with double strike. Whenever it enters the battlefield, we create a 4/1 cat 2 creature token with trample. Whenever a creature dies, if it had power greater than Drizzt's power, put a number of +1/+1 counters on Drizzt equal to the difference. It's a very aggressive card. It is kind of like the only reason why we're having 2 copies of, just because it's legendary. It is 5 mana. A lot of what we're trying to do is for the cheap mana, but it is always good to have an over the top kind of spell. And we have 2 copies of the Valkyrie Harbinger. It's a 6 mana 4/5 flying lifelinker. At the beginning of each of our end step, if we gain 4 more life this turn, we've created 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. So just another card that helps us kind of gain some life. It is a 4/5 itself with lifelink, so we get to gain life that way. So we have one way or another we're going to be able to gain that life up, and then trigger Righteous Valkyrie out if we get that angel on the battlefield. And then trigger all these other things that can also trigger life gain triggers as well. And the mana base is straightforward: 9 plains, 7 forests, 4 of the tree lines, and 4 of the pathways. Not again, just another great deck that I do think is a very decent way to start out playing a lot of the aggro style matchups of Magic. From what I remember, from what I saw in the comments of the starter deck list, this is probably one of the ones that people talked about the most, liking the most. I mean, guys, if there's anything that you guys want to leave comments down below, maybe there's things that maybe you tweaked in the starter decks already on your own, let me know down in the comments below. I always like to hear you guys' feedback on any of the things that you guys like to see in these starter decks. And over the course of the next few days, I should be posting the rest of the starter decks. So, like I said, if you haven't seen the starter deck, you are playing a lot and you're looking for a way to upgrade it, you'll eventually be a video of it here on the channel. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, wanting to post new videos on the channel, hit the subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you later. Just wanted to give a special shout out to the channel members that you see your names here. These are the people who support the channel by either clicking the join button that's down below right next to the subscribe button if you want to get your name here on this list, or you can click the link in the description. I do appreciate it as it does help support the channel. Now on with your video.